The evening was quiet on the Cowboys' ranch. The kind of quiet that only happened when the wind stopped rolling across the dry land and the sky held its breath. The sun had already gone down behind the hills, leaving a soft orange glow that faded slowly into blue. The cowboy, named Luke by most folks, had finished feeding the horses and checking the fence line. He was used to ending his days alone, with only the sound of crickets and the soft creak of the barn door moving in the breeze. He walked toward his cabin with slow, easy steps, thinking about the next day's work. The cattle needed new markers, and the south fence needed repairs. Nothing unusual, just the simple life he had built over the years. But as he reached for the lantern hanging outside the door, he heard a noise behind the barn. It was soft at first, almost like a branch falling. He turned his head slightly, listening more carefully. Then he heard it again, a shuffle of feet. Something too light to be a wild animal, yet too uncertain to be anything familiar. Luke stood still for a moment. The ranch was miles away from the nearest town. People didn't just wander onto his land this late, unless something was wrong. He set down the lantern, reached for the old rifle leaning near the steps not to scare anyone, only for safety, and started walking toward the sound. His boots made a dull thud on the dry ground. When he rounded the corner of the barn, his breath caught in his chest. A woman stood there, half hidden in the shadows, her clothes dusty and worn from long travel. She looked to be Apache, and she was clearly exhausted. Her shoulders dropped as if carrying a heavy weight, and her steps were unsteady, as though she had been walking for far too long. The moment she saw him, she tensed, ready to run or defend herself if needed. Luke immediately lowered his rifle to show he meant no harm. She didn't speak at first. She kept her hands close to her body, her eyes searching his face to understand his intention. Luke could tell she was scared not of him specifically, but of the idea of trusting any stranger out here in the open land. He understood that feeling. This land taught everyone to be careful. "It's all right," Luke said softly, making sure his voice stayed calm. "You look cold. You need a place to rest?" The woman hesitated. She glanced toward the dark horizon, as if she expected danger to appear at any moment. Then she looked back at him, studying his eyes, trying to find some sign of whether he was lying or trying to trick her. When she didn't see anything threatening, she gave a small nod, slow, unsure, but hopeful. Luke motioned toward the cabin. "Come on, you can warm up inside." As she walked behind him, he noticed her steps were weak. She wasn't injured, but she was on the edge of exhaustion. When they reached the cabin, he pushed the door open and let the warm air from the small fire inside welcome her. The room was simple, just a table, a corner for tools, a bed pushed against the wall, and a small stove where he often cooked beans or stew. But tonight, to the woman, it must have looked like a safe haven. She stood near the doorway, as if unsure she was truly welcome. Luke gestured toward the fire. "Sit. Warm yourself. I'll get you something to eat." She slowly stepped forward, holding her hands close to the glowing flames. Luke busied himself in the kitchen area, pulling out the pot of stew he had made earlier. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and filling. He placed a bowl in front of her, along with a piece of bread. She stared at the food for a moment, as if not believing she could eat without needing to pay something in return. Luke simply sat on the other side of the table, giving her space. Finally, she lifted the spoon, tasted the stew, and closed her eyes like she hadn't had a warm meal in days. After a few minutes of silence, she spoke, her voice soft and careful. "Thank you." Luke nodded. "You don't need to tell me anything. I don't need answers. You're safe here for the night." The woman looked surprised. Most people she had met would ask questions immediately, where she came from, why she was traveling alone, or what trouble she might bring with her. But Luke wasn't like that. He had lived long enough to know that sometimes people didn't need questions. They needed warmth and rest first. She took a breath and said, "My name is Tala." "That's a good name," Luke said. "I'm Luke." Tala gave a small smile, small but real. Her shoulders relaxed a little as the warmth of the fire spread through her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was peaceful, not uncomfortable. Luke worked calmly to set up a spare blanket for her near the fire. He didn't offer the bed he knew she might refuse out of respect or caution, but he made sure the spot he gave her was warm and comfortable. He noticed how tired her eyes were, how she fought to stay awake even though she desperately needed sleep. He didn't push her to talk, but after a while, she offered a single piece of truth. "I cannot go back to my people tonight." Luke nodded. "Then, you stay here." Simple as that. Her eyes softened at his kindness. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and watched the fire crackle. Luke sat nearby, but far enough to give her space. His presence was quiet, steady, like the calm of an old tree that could be trusted. Night moved slowly, but in a peaceful way. The sound of the wind against the cabin and the steady pop of burning wood filled the room. Tala finally allowed herself to close her eyes. Luke saw her fighting it, as if she felt she needed to stay alert. But exhaustion won. She leaned back against the wall, her breathing evening out. Luke stood quietly and placed another blanket over her. He didn't touch her or wake her, just laid it gently so the cold wouldn't bother her. As he looked at her resting near his fire, he wondered how far she had come, what dangers she had faced, and why she had ended up alone near his barn. But he knew those were questions for another day. Maybe a day that would never come. Tonight was about giving someone a safe place. Nothing more. He sat down in his chair and watched the flames dance, thinking about how strange life could be. In all his years on this ranch, he had never had a visitor like Tala, someone who stepped into his home because she had nowhere else to go. Something told him this night would not end the way he expected. Something in the stillness hinted that this was only the beginning of a much bigger story. Outside, the land rested under the dark sky, unaware of the shift happening inside the small cabin. Luke didn't know yet that the simple choice he made to help a tired stranger on a cold night would lead to something far more unexpected. He didn't know that Tala was not alone on this land, that she was only the first of 4 who would reach his ranch. But that moment had not arrived yet. For now, the cabin was quiet, and one exhausted Apache woman slept peacefully for the first time in days, while a lonely cowboy kept watch over the fire, unaware of how much his life was about to change. Before the sun had even risen, the ranch began to stir not because of the morning wind or the sounds of animals waking, but because the horses near the corral were behaving strangely. Luke was a light sleeper, and years of living alone had trained him to notice even the smallest shift in sound. He opened his eyes the moment he heard the horses snorting and stamping their hooves against the ground. At first, he thought it might be a wandering coyote or a deer passing too close. But the noise continued, steady and uneasy. That was not how the horses acted around wild animals they recognized. This was something different. Luke quietly got out of his chair. Tala was still asleep near the fire, wrapped in blankets, her breathing calm and even. He didn't want to wake her unless there was real danger. He stepped outside gently, closing the door without making a sound. The early morning air was cold and still, carrying the faint smell of dew on dry grass. His boots touched the ground softly as he walked toward the corral. The sky was still dark, only a thin line of gray, hinting that dawn would come soon. Luke stopped near the fence and looked into the distance. Three somethings moved near the tree line. They were faint figures at first, shadows blending with the night. Luke narrowed his eyes, his hand resting on the fence, as he tried to make out who or what was approaching. The movements weren't like animals. They were too steady, too human. He felt a quiet tension forming in his chest. He took a slow breath and moved a bit closer, keeping his steps steady. The horses backed away from the fence, restless. Luke glanced toward the cabin. Tala was still inside, unaware. He felt a sudden need to protect her, though he didn't know from whom. As he took another step forward, a branch cracked near the trees. That sound was enough to confirm it. People were out there. Luke kept his voice low, calm, but firm. "Who's out there?" The figures froze. Silence stretched across the land. Luke waited. He wasn't a man who scared easily, but he was cautious. When no reply came, he spoke again, making sure his tone carried no threat. "I won't harm you. Step out where I can see you." More silence. Then, slowly, 3 silhouettes separated from the shadows and stepped into the faint morning light. 3 women. Apache women. Luke felt a small shock run through him, not fear, but surprise. They were young, tired-looking, wrapped in worn blankets, and carrying small bundles. Their faces showed worry, exhaustion, and uncertainty. They looked like they had been traveling as long as, or even longer than Tala had. The tallest woman, who appeared to be their natural leader, raised her hand slightly to show she carried no weapon. Luke nodded, letting them know he understood. One of the women whispered something to the leader in Apache, her voice trembling. Luke couldn't understand their words, but he understood their fear. Out on this land, trust was hard to give, especially to strangers. He lifted his hands a little, just as she had done, and spoke softly. "It's all right. I mean no harm." The leader exchanged a look with the other 2, then stepped forward cautiously. Luke noticed they were all shivering, cold from travel, cold from fear, cold from being so far from safety. When the first rays of dawn touched the edge of the sky, Luke saw something else. The 3 women were not strangers to Tala. He recognized the same style of clothing, the same woven patterns on their blankets, and the same tired, worried look in their eyes. And then it clicked. Tala was not traveling alone. These 3 were likely her companions, the rest of her group separated by darkness or danger or something worse. Before Luke could speak again, the cabin door opened behind him. Tala stepped out, blinking at the morning light. She wrapped the blanket around her tightly and looked confused for a moment. Then her eyes widened. She recognized them instantly. "Tala?" One of the women called out softly. Tala rushed forward, her steps quick and full of emotion. She reached them and touched their hands, their shoulders, confirming they were real and safe. It was clear they shared a bond, sisters, cousins, or perhaps close friends from the same community. Relief washed over their faces, like a wave breaking after a long storm. Luke felt the tightness in his chest ease. He had been ready for danger. But instead, he found a reunion. The leader of the 3 women turned to him. She seemed unsure of what he would do next. Tala looked at Luke, her eyes saying more than words could. She needed him to understand something difficult, something she had not told him the night before. "We were traveling together," she finally said. "But the night was dark. We got separated." Luke nodded slowly. "And you've been looking for each other since." Tala lowered her head in agreement. The 3 new arrivals looked cold, hungrier than Tala had been, and unsure if Luke would allow them near his home. Luke understood the silent question in their eyes. He didn't hesitate. "You all can come inside," he said gently. "No one should be out in the cold like this." The women exchanged surprised glances. They had expected fear, rejection, or at least strict conditions. Instead, they found kindness. The leader stepped forward, her expression softening slightly. She gave a small nod, a thank you expressed without words. Luke guided them toward the cabin, opening the door wide so the warm air could welcome them. They stepped inside cautiously. Tala watched them with relief, but also with nervous hope, as if she was waiting for something to go wrong. But Luke simply pulled out more blankets, set them near the fire, and prepared to heat water so they could drink something warm. The 3 women sat close to one another, trying to recover from the long night. Tala introduced them softly. Their names were Nia, Asha, and Miana. Luke nodded respectfully at each of them, making sure they felt acknowledged and safe. As they warmed their hands near the fire, Luke began preparing food again, another pot of stew, a little more bread, and water heated just right for drinking. The women watched him with quiet amazement. They weren't used to strangers showing such gentle hospitality. But Luke didn't think much of it. He had always believed a person should help others when they could. Tala sat beside the fire, watching him with a thoughtful expression. She had never expected him to accept 3 more people on such short notice. She had barely trusted herself to ask for shelter. And he had already offered far more than she thought possible. As the sun began to rise fully, painting the sky with soft gold, the women slowly relaxed. Their shoulders lowered, their breathing steadied, and the fear in their eyes began to fade. Luke didn't ask questions. He didn't ask why they were traveling, where they were going, or what danger they might be escaping. He understood that people told their stories when they were ready, not before. He simply made sure they had food, warmth, and space to rest. When all 4 women had settled, Tala looked at Luke with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple, but her voice carried depth, honesty, and relief. Luke nodded. "You're safe here. Stay as long as you need." The land outside slowly brightened. The horses calmed. The morning took shape. And inside the small cabin, the cowboy and the 4 Apache women shared a moment of peace, something rare on a land full of hardship. The night that had begun with one unexpected visitor had become something much more. 4 travelers had found safety, and Luke had found himself responsible for people he had never met before. He didn't know their story yet, but he knew one thing clearly. He would protect them the same way he protected his home, with quiet strength, patience, and calm. And deep inside, he sensed this was only the beginning. The storm arrived faster than Luke expected. By mid-morning, thick, gray clouds had rolled in, covering the sky like a heavy blanket. The wind picked up and carried the smell of rain, the kind that made travel dangerous on open land. Luke stepped outside for a moment, watching the sky shift from light to dark within minutes. He knew what this meant. The 4 Apache women could not continue their journey today. Maybe not even tomorrow. When he stepped back inside, he saw all 4 women sitting near the fire. Nia and Asha were trying to help Miana warm her hands. Tala looked up at him as he entered, her expression asking a silent question. Would he ask them to leave? Would he think they were trouble? Would he turn them away now that the weather was changing? Luke shook the rain off his hat and spoke calmly. "A storm's coming. You all stay here until it passes." The relief on their faces was clear, though they tried not to show too much. Tala let out a breath she had been quietly holding. Nia exchanged a small glance with Asha. Miana, the youngest, finally let her shoulders relax. They had been traveling for days, sleeping outdoors in cold weather. A storm would have been dangerous for them. Luke walked to the fire and added more wood. "You'll be safe inside. This cabin can hold strong. It's not fancy, but it's warm." Tala nodded slowly. "You've already done much for us." Luke shrugged lightly. Doing what's right isn't a burden. The women fell silent, not out of discomfort, but because they were unsure how to respond. They weren't used to this kind of kindness from strangers. They were used to being cautious, always on guard, always calculating whether someone meant harm. Luke's steady, gentle nature confused them, in a good way. As the storm began outside, the rain hit the roof like soft drumming. The sound filled the cabin, giving it a peaceful rhythm. Luke checked all the windows, making sure they were closed tight so the wind wouldn't blow through the cracks. The fire crackled warmly, casting soft light across the room. The women wrapped themselves in blankets. Their bodies were tired, but their minds were slowly settling. For the first time in days, they did not have to look over their shoulders. Luke moved around the cabin with calm purpose, preparing a meal for all 5 of them. He cooked beans, warmed bread on the stove, and brewed water for hot tea. The smell of food filled the room, bringing comfort to everyone. When he handed each of them a bowl, they accepted it with quiet gratitude. After several minutes of silent eating, Asha spoke in a soft voice. "We were trying to reach our relatives," she said, "in the valley past the ridges." Luke listened attentively, not interrupting. "We traveled as a group," Nia added. "But we lost our way when the nights became too cold. We walked for miles, hoping to find a safe place." Tala looked into her bowl before speaking. "I saw your ranch's light. I trusted it." Luke nodded slowly. "Sometimes a light is all a person needs." The storm became heavier outside. Rain crashed against the roof, and the wind whistled sharply. Inside, the cabin felt even warmer, more like a safe shelter than ever before. The women pulled their blankets tighter, listening to the storm. Each of them understood how lucky they were to have reached this place when they did. Luke stood near the window, watching the land disappear under the thick sheet of rain. He wasn't a man who talked much, but he felt responsible now in a way he hadn't expected. He had taken in one traveler last night. Now he was watching over 4. He didn't know why they had been separated from their group, but he understood what being lost felt like. He knew what it meant to hope for a helping hand. Tala slowly moved closer to him. "If not for you," she said, her voice soft but firm, "we would be outside in this storm." He glanced at her. "Anyone would have helped." She shook her head gently. "No, not everyone." Luke looked back out at the rain. He didn't disagree. Many people hesitated to help others, especially those they did not fully understand. But he was not built like those people. To him, kindness wasn't complicated. After they finished eating, the women quietly helped clean the dishes. They moved around the cabin with gentle steps, respecting Luke's space, but also trying not to feel useless. Miana wiped the table carefully. Asha folded the blankets. Nia swept the floor with a small broom. Luke kept near the door. Tala cleaned the bowls and placed them neatly on the shelf. Luke appreciated the help, though he hadn't expected it. These women were tired, but they still wanted to do something in return. He saw determination in their actions, not just survival, but pride. The hours passed slowly. The storm didn't ease. The rain stayed strong, and the wind grew louder. The cabin shook lightly from time to time, but Luke had built it well. It had stood against storms before, and would stand through this one too. As the day turned into evening, the fire became the center of their world. The warm glow softened the corners of the room and reflected off their calm faces. Tala sat closest to the fire, her eyes watching the flames. Miana leaned against her shoulder, exhausted. Nia and Asha wrapped themselves in shared blankets, their heads resting back against the wall. Luke sat across from them, carving a small piece of wood with a pocket knife. The soft scrape of the blade against the wood joined the sounds of the storm, creating a simple rhythm that made the cabin feel peaceful. Tala finally spoke again. "Why did you help us?" Luke paused for a moment. He wasn't used to explaining himself, but he knew she deserved an answer. "Because you needed help," he said simply. "Because it was the right thing to do. Because the land is hard enough without people turning away from each other." Tala watched him carefully. She didn't speak, but her eyes softened. She understood him more clearly now. He was a man who lived by simple principles, not complicated motives. He offered shelter because he believed every person deserved a chance to rest safely, no matter who they were or where they came from. As the night settled in, the storm outside grew quieter. The rain softened, the wind slowed. The world outside the cabin slowly calmed. Inside, the women grew drowsy. Miana fell asleep first, her breathing soft. Asha and Nia followed soon after, huddled close together. Tala stayed awake the longest, watching the storm lighten through the small window. Luke stood and placed more wood on the fire. You should rest, he said gently. You've had a long journey. When Peely won. Tala hesitated. I don't want to sleep too deeply. Not yet. You're safe here, he said again. The storm will pass. I'll keep watch. She finally nodded, trusting his words more than she realized. She wrapped the blanket around herself and lay down near the fire. Luke sat back in his chair, watching the flames flicker softly against the walls. The cabin grew quiet. Outside, the storm faded. Inside, peace settled like a blanket over everyone. Luke looked at the 4 sleeping women and knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. They would have to decide what came next, whether to continue their journey or stay until they regained their strength. But for tonight, his job was simple. He would keep them safe. He didn't know why they had crossed his path. He didn't know what their story truly was. But he knew one thing clearly. Bringing them inside had been the right choice. And deep inside, he sensed that their paths were now tied together at least for a while longer. The storm ended slowly, the way storms often do first. The loud winds faded, then the rain softened to a light patter, and finally the sky quieted until only the drip of water from the cabin roof remained. By morning, the land outside looked washed clean. The air smelled fresh, the soil darker, and the trees near the ranch sparkled with dew. Luke was the first to wake. He stepped outside quietly, careful not to disturb the 4 women still asleep inside. The ground was damp beneath his boots, and the sky carried a soft pink color from the rising sun. Everything felt calm, peaceful, and new. The storm had passed, but the weight of responsibility was still on his shoulders. He knew today the women would think about leaving, but he also knew they weren't fully ready. When he returned inside, Tala was awake. She sat near the fire, her blanket pulled around her shoulders. She looked rested, though her eyes carried the sadness of someone who had been moving for too long. She gave Luke a small nod. The storm is gone. Yeah, Luke said. Weather's clear. Roads will dry soon. Tala hesitated before asking, You think we should go today? Luke touched his hat lightly, thinking. That depends. You all still look tired. Storm might be over, but the land is still wet and rough. You could slip, or lose your path again. Tala appreciated that he wasn't forcing them to leave. She appreciated his honesty, too. She didn't like depending on strangers. But Luke wasn't like most strangers. His words felt safe. One by one, the other 3 women woke up. Nia stretched her arms slowly, careful not to disturb Asha, who slept lightly beside her. Miana rubbed her eyes and blinked at the soft morning light coming through the window. Luke cooked breakfast, simple food, but warm and filling. The women sat together, eating quietly while exchanging small looks of relief. For the first time in days, they were not hungry, not freezing, and not looking over their shoulders. After breakfast, Luke stepped outside to check the land. The women followed him out, standing together near the fence as he looked at the sky. Nia was the first to speak. We need to reach our relatives. Asha nodded. They will worry if we do not return. Miana looked down at her hands. We are stronger now. Because of your help. Luke nodded slowly. He understood. They had to continue their journey, even if staying here felt safer for the moment. The world outside wasn't gentle, but their people were waiting for them. But he also saw something they were trying to hide. Their bodies were still weak. Days of walking, cold nights, and fear had drained them. One storm-free morning wasn't enough to undo that. Tala stepped forward. We do not want to trouble you more. Luke shook his head. You're not trouble. Tala met his eyes. There was respect there, now deep. Steady respect. Still, you've done enough for us. Luke leaned on the fence, looking at the hills beyond the ranch. If you stay one more day, he said gently, you'll leave stronger. I can make you a small pack, each food, water, blankets, enough to reach that valley without running out. Asha exchanged a glance with Nia. They didn't want to ask for more help, but they also knew he was right. Traveling today would be hard. Dangerous, even. Finally, Tala nodded. Just one more day. Luke smiled softly. One more day. The women helped around the ranch to show their gratitude. They didn't want to sit idly after receiving so much kindness. Luke tried to tell them they didn't need to work, but they insisted. So, he let them. Nia helped brush the horses, speaking to them softly in her native language. The animals relaxed around her, as if they understood her comforting voice. Asha carried wood from the shed to the cabin, stacking it neatly. Miana picked wild herbs near the trees, giving Luke a handful to flavor the stew later. Tala helped him clean tools, moving with quiet grace. As the day warmed, the ranch felt alive with gentle activity. Luke watched the women work with silent admiration. They were strong, despite everything they had been through. They were determined, and they worked together as if connected by something unbreakable. In the afternoon, Luke prepared supplies for their journey: small bags of dried food, flasks of clean water, and strong blankets. He even stitched a tear in Tala's traveling cloth, working slowly, making sure it would last through the trip. Tala watched him silently for a moment before speaking. You did not ask us anything. Not about our past. Not about why we traveled. Luke didn't look up from his stitching. Sometimes people don't need questions. Sometimes they just need help. Tala smiled gently. It was a quiet smile, filled with gratitude. She had met many people in her life, but very few like him. Few who helped without expecting anything in return. The evening came softly. The land glowed with the last light of day. Luke and the women sat outside the cabin, eating stew and watching the sky turn orange. The world felt calm and peaceful again, as though the storm had never existed. Miana broke the silence. We will leave tomorrow. Luke nodded. You already did so much, Asha said. Doesn't cost anything to walk. Luke replied with a small smile. Tala looked at him quietly. She knew he meant every word. When night settled, the women slept earlier than before. Their bodies were still tired, but their hearts felt lighter. Luke stayed awake a little longer, sitting near the fire with his thoughts. He realized he would miss them. Their presence had filled his quiet home with something warm, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Early the next morning, before sunrise, the sky was clear. The air carried a gentle chill. Luke helped them gather their things, making sure everything was ready. They stood near the gate, the place where their journey would continue. Tala stepped forward first. She met Luke's eyes with a soft, steady look. Thank you for giving us safety when we had none. Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from emotion. Nia nodded. We will not forget your kindness. Aisha placed her hand on her chest. Nor your patience. Even Miana, usually quiet, stepped close and said, You changed our journey. Luke felt something tighten in his chest. He wasn't used to emotional moments. He simply tipped his hat and said, You're welcome. Travel safe. The women turned to leave, walking together toward the ridge. Their silhouettes looked small against the wide-open land. Their steps were steady, confident, filled with renewed strength. Halfway to the ridge, Tala looked back. Luke was still standing by the gate, watching them leave. She lifted her hand in a quiet farewell. Luke raised his hand back. Then they continued onward, their figures growing smaller until the land swallowed them gently. Luke stood there for a long time, feeling a strange mix of peace and emptiness. His ranch was quiet again, the way it had been before they arrived. But something inside him had changed. His home felt warmer now, because kindness had passed through it. He walked back toward the cabin, hearing the soft crunch of dirt under his boots. The morning sun rose higher, lighting the fields with golden color. Luke breathed deeply, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. He didn't know if he would ever see the four women again, but he knew one thing clearly. The night he opened his door to a tired woman had changed more than their journey. It had changed him, too, and he would remember them always.